If you take a living human cell, let's say a single unfertilized human egg,
Right.
and you just take it and drop it into the freezer sitting in your kitchen, you might naturally assume it would just peacefully go to sleep.
Yeah, that's the common assumption for sure.
But chemically speaking, it will actually violently shred itself to pieces from the inside out.
It's an absolute biological disaster.
Exactly. Yet right now, as we're talking, in reproductive clinics all over the world, there is human potential sitting in vats of liquid nitrogen.
At minus 196 degrees Celsius.
Minus 196. And it is surviving there flawlessly for decades. So today, we are looking at the impossible physics of how we actually pause biological time.
We really are.
We're stepping into the sub-zero world of the cryopreservation lab. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to build a complete, comforting mental map of one of the most profound achievements in modern thermodynamics.
And cellular biology, of course.
Right. We're unpacking the deep dive materials surrounding the physics of flash freezing, the chemical biology of cellular preservation, and the intense structural safety protocols that guard these cells.
And to truly grasp the gravity of the materials we are diving into today, we have to completely reframe how we view this entire process.
How so?
Well, there is this lingering misconception out there that freezing biological material is, a sort of medical backup plan.
Like a safety net.
Exactly. A safety net born of a failed initial attempt. Like, oh, we couldn't use it now, so I guess we'll freeze it. But the reality of modern cryopreservation is vastly different.
And it's much more deliberate than that.
Oh, absolutely. It is not a backup plan at all. It is a highly sophisticated, intentionally planned optimization tool.
Right.
The primary objective is to perfectly lock a cell's current viability in place. We are shielding its microscopic architecture so completely that when it is finally warmed...
Whether that's in a few months or, 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. Even 20 years from now. When it's warmed, it emerges biologically identical to the absolute second it was frozen.
So we were talking about halting the chronological clock entirely.
Yes, completely pausing time.
And to trace that journey today, we are going to maintain a very slow, deliberate focus.
I think that's the best way to approach it.
Yeah, we'll follow the precise pathways of embryos, of sperm, and of the human egg, the oocyte.
Right, the oocyte.
We'll look closely at the specific maturation stages that embryologists work with on the cryobench. So specifically the M1 and M2 stages of those oocytes.
Which is a really crucial distinction we'll get into.
But I feel like if we really want to understand how a laboratory pulls off this pause in time, we first have to ask why that kitchen freezer would be so catastrophic. Like what makes dropping the temperature so incredibly dangerous to a living cell?
Well, it really comes down to a fundamental paradox in biology.
Okay.
The molecule that is absolutely most essential to life is also the exact molecule that will destroy it when the temperature drops.
You're talking about water.
I am. We have to confront the problem of water. Human cells, and particularly very large cells like the oocyte, are primarily composed of water.
Right. They're basically tiny water balloons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to understand the danger there, we have to look at the physics of what actually happens to a water molecule when it loses heat.
So in a standard slow cooling environment.
Yeah, like your domestic freezer.
Yeah.
In that environment, water molecules lose their kinetic energy very, very gradually.
They slow down.
Right. And as they slow down, they stop bouncing off of one another so randomly, and they begin to interact. They form hydrogen bonds.
Okay.
And they organize themselves into a very specific, highly rigid structure.
That structure is what we just call ice.
Yes.
Which, feels completely benign to us when it's clinking around in a glass of water.
Sure, it's refreshing.
But at a microscopic scale, organized water is a completely different beast.
It is a lethal force.
Yeah.
I mean, truly lethal.
Yeah.
That rigid structure is technically a crystalline lattice.
A lattice.
And if you zoom in on an ice crystal as it's forming, it is not smooth. It is essentially a collection of razor-sharp, microscopic needles.
Wow. Just microscopic blades.
Literally. Now, imagine those needles forming inside the delicate microscopic envelope of a human cell.
Oh, man.
Right. As the water inside the cell freezes, those crystalline spikes just shoot outward in all directions.
So they would just tear right through everything.
Exactly. They physically pierce the delicate lipid bilayer of the cell membrane. They rupture the internal architecture.
Like the organelles.
Yeah, the mitochondria, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum. The cell is literally torn apart by its own intercellular fluid.
That is, I mean, that's just a horrifying image. So the very thing keeping the cell alive at room temperature becomes an internal weapon at sub-zero temperatures.
That's exactly what happens.
Has science always understood that this was the main barrier? Because I know laboratories have been freezing biological material for decades.
Oh, yes. Long before the ultramodern techniques we use today.
Did they just accept the damage back then?
They did understand it, but the early history of preservation was just fraught with intense cellular damage. Historically, labs utilized a technique called slow freezing.
Slow freezing.
The concept was actually an attempt to use ice to their advantage rather than fighting it entirely.
How do you use those ice needles to your advantage?
Well, the goal was to carefully control the temperature drop so that ice crystals would form on the outside of the cell first, in the surrounding fluid.
Okay, while trying to prevent them from forming inside.
Exactly.
But wait, how does freezing the fluid outside the cell help protect the fluid inside? Wouldn't the cold just seep in and freeze the inside anyway?
It relies on an indirect chemical reaction, actually. When water outside the cell turns into pure ice, it leaves behind all the salts and solutes that were dissolved in it.
Oh, I see. Because the ice is just pure water.
Right. So the remaining liquid water outside the cell suddenly becomes hyper-concentrated with all those leftover solutes.
Like it's really salty.
Extremely salty. And this creates a massive osmotic gradient. Well, nature always wants to find balance, right? So that high salt environment outside the cell begins slowly sucking the pure water out of the cell.
Out through the cell membrane.
Yes, trying to dilute the really salty surrounding fluid.
Wow. So the idea was to let the outside ice pull the internal water out before the inside could actually freeze and form those needles.
That was the theory. You dehydrate the cell through a slow, agonizing temperature drop.
Agonizing seems like the right word for that.
It was. It was incredibly risky and highly inefficient. The cells were subjected to prolonged periods of severe biological stress.
I can imagine.
They were essentially marinating in these highly concentrated salt solutions for extended periods while the temperature just slowly fell.
And for massive water-heavy cells like the human oocyte, that must have been brutal.
It was devastating. The survival rates for the oocyte using slow freezing were often incredibly low. The structural damage was simply too great to overcome reliably.
Which means the entire field of reproductive medicine had to pivot at some point.
They absolutely had to.
Because if slow freezing is too damaging and managing the ice slowly is basically a losing battle, you have to find a way to completely outrun the formation of ice altogether.
And that realization is what led to the transition to modern ultra-rapid vitrification.
Vitrification.
Right. The objective shifted entirely from managing ice to completely depriving water molecules of the opportunity to organize in the first place.
So speed becomes the most important factor.
Exactly. To do this, the cell's temperature must plunge so incredibly fast that it crosses what is known as the glass transition temperature.
Glass transition temperature.
Yes, it has to cross that threshold before a single hydrogen bond can lock into a crystalline lattice.
Well, wait, I have a physics question here.
Sure.
If water expands when it freezes, right? Like, if you leave a full plastic water bottle in your car in the dead of winter.
Right. It freezes, expands, and bursts the plastic.
Exactly. If human cells are essentially full of water, how do you possibly vitrify a cell without freezing the water inside it? Even if you drop the temperature super rapidly, the water is still physically taking up space inside the cell, right?
That is the central problem, and it's what makes pure vitrification of a natural, unaltered cell basically impossible.
Really?
Yeah. You cannot safely freeze that massive volume of water inside the cell, regardless of how much speed you use.
So what's the workaround?
The biological workaround is pretty radical, honestly.
Yeah.
You must chemically remove the water and completely replace it before the temperature ever begins to drop.
Whoa. So we have to build a chemical shield.
Exactly.
We are completely swapping out the internal fluids of a living human cell while it's just sitting on a laboratory bench?
It sounds like science fiction.
Yeah.
Yes. We initiate this highly choreographed dance of dehydration and chemical substitution.
And what are we swapping the water out for?
The agents we use to achieve this are known as cryoprotectants, or CPAs.
CPAs.
These are specialized, non-toxic, well, relatively non-toxic chemical compounds that basically act as a biological antifreeze.
Biological antifreeze.
Right. And they operate in a dual action system. The embryologist utilizes both non-permeating CPAs and permeating CPAs to execute this whole fluid swap safely.
I want to break down both halves of that shield slowly because the mechanisms here are just fascinating to me.
Let's do it.
So what exactly is a non-permeating cryoprotectant doing?
Let's look at the non-permeating CPAs first.
Right.
A very common example used in the laboratory is a complex sugar, like sucrose.
Just normal sugar.
Basically. And as the categorization suggests, non-permeating CPAs are physically too large to cross the cellular membrane.
So they can't get inside the cell.
Exactly. If you place a cell in a fluid droplet that contains sucrose, the sucrose molecules remain entirely on the outside.
Okay.
But their sheer presence fundamentally alters the osmotic pressure of that environment. They create a hypertonic solution.
Meaning they act kind of like a sponge?
Yeah.
They are drawing things toward them?
The term frequently used in the scientific literature is an osmotic pump.
An osmotic pump.
Right, because the concentration of sucrose outside the cell is so much higher than the solute concentration inside the cell. The fundamental laws of diffusion just demand equilibrium.
Nature wants balance again.
Always. So the sucrose aggressively pulls the intracellular water out of the cell, drawing it right through that semi-permeable lipid membrane.
Wow.
It physically pulls the dangerous water away from those delicate internal organelles we talked about earlier.
But if you subject a living cell to a powerful osmotic pump and just strip all the water out of it, wouldn't the cell's physical structure just collapse?
It absolutely would.
Like letting all the air out of a balloon, the structural integrity would just be ruined?
The physical collapse is very real. And you're right. If we only used an osmotic pump, the cell would indeed be crushed.
So how do you stop that?
That is where the second half of the chemical shield is introduced, the permeating CPAs.
Ah, okay, the permeating ones.
Right. These are much smaller molecular structures, things like ethylene glycol or dimethyl sulfoxide, which is commonly known as DMSO.
DMSO, got it.
Because their molecular weight is so low, they can slip right through the cell membrane without any issue.
So they are rushing in while the water is rushing out?
It is a simultaneous exchange.
Incredible.
As the powerful osmotic pump of the sucrose pulls the water out of the cell, creating this vacuum of space, the permeating CPAs are slowly infiltrating the internal architecture.
Just taking up the empty space.
Yes. They move into the cell to take the water's place.
Yeah.
They surround the mitochondria. They weave through the endoplasmic reticulum.
So they're physically propping it up.
Exactly. They provide the essential physical scaffolding, so the cell does not crush in on itself permanently.
If you were to watch this happen, under a high-powered microscope in the lab, what does that physical exchange actually look like to the human eye?
It is a really dramatic, visceral reaction.
Yeah.
When the cell is first exposed to the solution, you literally watch it shrink violently as the water rapidly exits.
Just shrivels up.
Yes. The smooth outer membrane crinkles and completely collapses inward. And then very slowly, as those heavier permeating cryoprotectants steadily cross the membrane and fill that internal void, you watch the cell gradually expand back out.
Like blowing the balloon back up.
Exactly. It recovers its original spherical volume. It's practically breathing out water and breathing in antifreeze.
That brings up a terrifying variable in this equation, though.
What's that?
The antifreeze itself. If these permeating chemicals are replacing the internal water, they can't be a natural, healthy environment for a human cell to exist in for very long, right?
You have identified the ticking clock of the cryopreservation bench.
The ticking clock.
The ultimate catch to this entire process is toxicity.
Right, because it's still a chemical.
Exactly. These permeating cryoprotectants are extraordinarily effective at preventing ice crystal formation. But at room temperature...
Which is where this is all happening, right, on the bench?
Yes, which is exactly the temperature at which this fluid swap must occur. At room temperature, they are highly toxic to the living cell.
Oh, wow.
They will rapidly begin to denature the cell's proteins and completely break down its structural integrity.
So the embryologist is sitting there with this microscopic cell, essentially marinating it in a biological poison.
Yes.
Just trying to perfectly time the exit of the water.
That's entirely accurate. The margin for error is razor thin.
How thin are we talking?
Very thin. The embryologist must leave the cell in the chemical shield long enough for the water to fully evacuate and the antifreeze to fully penetrate.
Because if they rush it...
If they rush it, residual water remains inside, and the cell will shatter into those ice crystals when it's eventually frozen.
Right, the needles.
But if they leave the cell in the solution for even a few seconds too long, the antifreeze reaches lethal toxicity levels and irreversibly destroys the cell right there at room temperature.
Knowing that this toxicity clock is ticking so loudly, how does an embryologist physically manage this?
It requires intense focus.
Like, what is the actual sequence of events on the lab bench to safely apply this chemical shield without killing the cell in the process?
Well, the laboratory protocols utilize a sequential gradient to mitigate the shock.
A gradient.
Yes, you cannot take an oocyte or an embryo and drop it directly into a pool of pure antifreeze.
Too much shock.
The osmotic shock and the immediate toxicity would just destroy it instantly.
Okay.
Instead, the embryologist manually guides the cell through a highly specific series of droplet baths. They move from what is called the ES to the VS.
Okay, let's trace that journey slowly. Starting with the ES, what is that?
ES stands for equilibration solution.
Equilibration solution.
This is the staging ground. The ES droplet contains a significantly lower concentration of the permeating cryoprotectants.
So it's a milder bath.
Exactly. When the embryologist uses a microscopic pipette to place an embryo or perhaps an M1 or M2 stage oocyte into the ES drop, that initial water cryoprotectant swap begins at a much more manageable pace.
Okay.
The cell shrinks as the water begins to leave, and it slowly equilibrates as the lower dose CPA enters.
How long does the cell stay in that equilibration solution? Is the clock ticking really fast here?
The ES phase is relatively gentle, actually. Depending on the specific lab protocol and the type of cell, it might remain in that ES droplet for several minutes.
Okay, so they have a little bit of time.
Yes, it is a necessary primer. It's gently acclimatizing the cell's membrane to the presence of the chemicals and slowly removing the bulk of the free water.
But it's not enough to fully protect it yet.
No. The ES does not contain nearly enough antifreeze to actually prevent ice formation at minus 196 degrees.
So it's just preparing the cell for the main event.
Exactly. It prepares the cell to survive the VS or the vitrification solution.
Vitrification solution. And that's the intense one.
The VS droplet is the ultimate, highly concentrated chemical bath. It contains maximum levels of the permeating CPAs to fully saturate that internal architecture.
Okay.
And it contains high levels of the non-permeating CPAs, like our sucrose from earlier.
The osmotic pump.
Right, to forcefully rip away the absolute last microscopic remnants of intracellular water.
And when the cell touches that VS drop, that toxicity clock we talked about must just start screaming.
Oh, in the VS drop, the toxicity is at its absolute peak.
How long can it stay in there?
The cell can typically survive in this concentrated solution for less than a single minute.
Less than a minute.
Sometimes the protocol demands just 30 to 45 seconds of exposure.
Wow.
And during this tiny high-stakes window, the embryologist is working entirely under high magnification optics.
I want to focus on the human element of this for a moment, actually, because the embryologist isn't just pushing a button on a machine to do this.
Not at all. It's highly manual.
They are looking through a microscope using a tiny glass or plastic pipette, which the sources say is significantly thinner than a human hair.
It is incredibly fragile.
And they have to physically locate the embryo in the ES drop, draw it up, lift it through the air, and deposit it perfectly into the VS drop, all in seconds.
The manual dexterity required is simply staggering.
Yeah.
And they're making their timely decisions based on pure, real-time visual feedback.
What are they looking for?
Remember that violent shrinking and expanding reaction we discussed?
Yeah.
The embryologist is watching that happen live under the microscope. If they were working with, say, a day 5 blastocyst embryo, they will watch the entire blastocyst cavity physically collapse as the water exits into the VS drop.
Oh, wow.
They must stare through the lens, holding their pipette completely steady, just waiting for the precise second the cavity stops shrinking and stabilizes.
Because that tells them what?
That visual cue tells them the osmotic reaction has reached its limit.
They are essentially doing real-time calculus with their eyes.
They are.
Just determining when the osmotic pressure has perfectly equalized inside a microscopic sphere.
It's an incredible skill. And once that stabilization occurs, the chemical shield is fully formed.
The water is gone.
The water is gone. The cell is perfectly saturated with biological antifreeze.
But the cell is still sitting on a room temperature benchtop in a highly toxic bath, and the timer is running out.
It must cross the thermal threshold immediately.
Which brings us to the most critical physical barrier in the entire process, the microload and the plunge.
Yes, the climax of the process.
The cell is ready, it's shielded, but it is currently floating inside a droplet of fluid. And from what I understand, the fluid itself is now the enemy.
That's right. We have essentially traded the enemy of internal water for the enemy of external volume.
Oh, so?
The physics of heat transfer dictate that the speed at which any object cools is directly proportional to its mass and its surrounding volume.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if you place a large droplet of fluid into a sub-zero environment, the outer edges of that droplet cool first.
Right.
And it takes a measurable amount of time for that freezing temperature to actually reach the core of the droplet where the cell is.
Oh, I see. It acts as thermal insulation. The fluid is essentially a winter coat for the cell.
Exactly. Any excess fluid surrounding the cell buffers the temperature drop.
And we need speed.
Right. In vitrification, we need the cooling rate to be nearly instantaneous. We have to outrun any rogue remaining water molecules from finding each other and forming ice.
So if the cooling is slowed down by even a fraction of a second due to that thermal insulation,
The cryoprotectants may fail, and a lethal ice crystal could form.
so you have to strip the fluid away. But if you take a microscopic cell out of the fluid entirely and just expose it to the open air of the laboratory, wouldn't it just dry out and die instantly?
It would desiccate, yes.
Well, what do you do?
The embryologist has to find the absolute perfect equilibrium between too much thermal insulation and fatal desiccation.
That sounds impossible.
It's difficult. This is where the engineering of the microstraw comes into play.
Let's break down the mechanics of the microload. The embryologist takes this device, which the sources describe as looking like an ultra-thin plastic wand or maybe a tiny hook.
Yes, very delicate.
They use their microscopic pipette to pick up the embryo from the VS drop, and they place it near the very tip of this plastic wand.
Correct.
But then they have to siphon away the surrounding fluid.
They must draw the fluid away until almost nothing remains.
How little are we talking?
The strict protocols dictate that the surrounding fluid droplet must be minimized to a volume of less than 1 single microliter.
Less than a microliter. How do you even visualize a microliter for the listener?
Well, imagine a single human teardrop.
Okay.
Now, mentally divide that one teardrop into hundreds of microscopic individual fragments.
Hundreds. Wow.
The embryologist leaves only one of those invisible fragments surrounding the cell.
Just a single fragment of a teardrop.
It is nothing more than an imperceptible film.
So the thermal mass is essentially reduced to zero.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The cell is now entirely exposed, shielded internally by its chemical antifreeze, and externally by nothing more than a molecular whisper of moisture.
And the second they achieve that microvolume load, there is no time to double-check their work.
None at all. The toxicity clock is at zero.
The embryologist must physically move their hand, taking that tiny plastic straw from the warm stage of the microscope directly into a bath of liquid nitrogen.
We call it the plunge.
The plunge.
And the physical transition from the room temperature environment to the sub-zero bath takes less than 1 second.
Let's look at the staggering numbers behind that 1 second of free fall. Because the physics here defy common sense to me.
The thermal shock is almost difficult to comprehend.
Walk us through the math.
The cell drops from roughly 37 degrees Celsius, which is its biological baseline, or at least the warm room temperature of the heated bench.
Right.
And it drops down to minus 196 degrees Celsius instantaneously.
Instantaneously.
The sources indicate that because the fluid volume is less than a microliter, the cooling rates achieved during the plunge frequently exceed 20,000 degrees Celsius per minute.
20,000 degrees per minute. That is, the molecules simply cannot process the heat loss fast enough to react.
They're completely paralyzed.
Paralyzed.
And this is the exact moment we can definitively define the term vitrification.
What actually happens to that sub-microliter droplet of fluid in that fraction of a second?
Because of the extreme concentration of cryoprotectants, the absence of internal water, and that staggering 20,000 degree per minute cooling rate, the fluid does not freeze into ice.
It bypasses crystallization entirely.
Exactly. Instead, it instantaneously solidifies into an amorphous, glass-like state.
It turns into glass, not ice.
It is a true solid, but it possesses absolutely no internal crystalline structure.
No needles?
No lattices, no microscopic needles, no sharp edges at all.
Wow.
It is a perfect, smooth, solid suspension of the cell. It's frozen in the exact physical configuration it held a millisecond prior.
That is the marvel of vitrification.
It really is.
It's an incredible image, just a cellular time capsule suspended in microscopic glass.
Yes.
But once that straw hits the liquid nitrogen, the physics shift from active preservation to perpetual maintenance.
That's right. Once submerged, the strict laws of thermodynamics take over entirely.
Okay.
The cell is perfectly safe in its glass state, but it's a highly volatile safety.
What do you mean by volatile?
The absolute rule is that the cell can never, under any circumstances, be allowed to rise above its specific glass transition temperature.
Not even a little bit.
Not even slightly. If the temperature warms even slightly, And we're talking even if it stays far below zero, but just rises above that transition threshold.
What happens?
The violently paralyzed water molecules will suddenly regain just enough kinetic energy to move.
Oh, no.
And because they are so desperately trying to reach a stable state, they will instantly snap together and form those lethal ice crystals.
So if the storage tank warms up by a few degrees, the glass shatters into ice, and the cell is completely destroyed.
Exactly. The vitrification must be rigorously, endlessly maintained.
Okay, so now everything we have mapped out so far, the ES and VS chemical gradients, the toxicity race, the microvolume load, the 20,000-degree plunge, this entire nerve-wracking sequence is specifically tailored for massive, complex structures.
Yes, like day 5 embryos.
Right, or those M1 and M2 oocytes. But when we look through the sources, there is an entirely different biological pathway detailed for another critical piece of human reproduction.
Yes, there is.
The andrology pathway, the science of freezing sperm.
The contrast there is fascinating. We are still governed by the same fundamental physics of freezing, but the biological canvas we are manipulating is drastically different.
Because it's a different cell type.
Right. Sperm preservation relies on distinct principles because the architecture of the cell actually changes the rules of engagement.
And to understand why, I suppose we just have to look back at our primary enemy, water.
Precisely. If intracellular water is the singular threat that dictates the need for complex chemical shields and ultra-rapid vitrification, then a cell's geometry dictates its vulnerability.
Let's compare them.
Well, consider the vast architecture of the oocyte. As we said, it is one of the largest single cells in the human body.
The water balloon.
Right. It is effectively a massive spherical water balloon filled with cytoplasm. That immense volume of water makes it exquisitely fragile.
Demanding the intense protocols we just discussed?
Yes. But the architecture of a sperm cell is built for a completely different purpose.
Okay, how so?
A sperm cell is a masterclass in biological minimalism.
Minimalism.
Its sole biological mandate is the delivery of genetic material. It is not designed to incubate or nourish a growing embryo.
So it doesn't need all the extra baggage.
Exactly. Through its development, it strips away nearly every component that isn't strictly necessary for propulsion and delivery.
Interesting.
As a result, it contains an incredibly minuscule amount of cytoplasm. It is essentially a highly condensed, tightly packed payload of DNA inside a tiny head.
Attached to the tail.
Right, attached to a biological motor and a flagellum.
Minimal cytoplasm means minimal water.
And minimal water translates directly to built-in resilience.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Sperm cells are inherently far more resistant to freezing damage because there simply isn't enough internal water available to form those massive, destructive crystalline lattices that would shred a larger cell.
That makes perfect sense.
Additionally, the DNA inside the sperm head is not loose. It is highly condensed and tightly coiled around specialized proteins.
So it's physically fortified.
Yes, it naturally fortifies the genetic material against structural thermal stress.
So if the sperm cell is naturally armored against the cold, how does that translate to the embryologist's workflow? Like, they aren't executing that high-stakes sub-microliter plunge.
No, not at all. The protocol is remarkably simpler and far more forgiving.
Wow.
Because the laboratory isn't fighting massive volumes of intracellular water, they don't need to utilize the extreme, highly toxic, permeating cryoprotectants required for oocyte vitrification.
So what do they use?
Sperm can be effectively shielded using far simpler traditional cryoprotectants.
What kind of chemicals are we talking about here?
Historically, andrology labs used yolk-based extenders.
Like egg yolk?
Basically, yes. But modern facilities predominantly rely on glycerol-based solutions.
Glycerol, okay.
Glycerol is a permeating cryoprotectant, meaning it does enter the cell to provide support, but it is vastly less toxic to the sperm cell than something like DMSO is to an embryo.
So it provides the necessary membrane stabilization without the screaming toxicity clog.
Exactly. The embryologist has much more time to work with.
And the cooling process itself. If we aren't terrified of instant ice crystallization from massive water volumes, we don't need to drop the temperature at 20,000 degrees a minute.
We don't. Sperm freezing typically utilizes a controlled rate or vapor freezing technique.
Vapor freezing.
Right. The embryologist doesn't have to painstakingly isolate a sub-microliter droplet.
So they don't use the little straws.
Well, the sperm sample is mixed with the glycerol cryoprotectant and loaded into significantly larger plastic vials or standard-sized straws.
Okay, so much larger volumes.
Yes, these larger containers hold massive fluid volumes compared to the vitrification microstraw.
But wait, If you plunge a massive fluid vial directly into liquid nitrogen, the thermal insulation we talked about earlier would just ruin it, right? The middle wouldn't freeze fast enough.
Exactly, which is why they don't plunge it directly into the liquid.
Oh, what do they do?
Instead, these larger vials are suspended in the nitrogen vapor,
The vapor.
the freezing gas layer sitting just above the liquid nitrogen line in a tank. The vapor is incredibly cold, but it doesn't pull heat away as violently as the liquid does.
Oh, I see. It's like stepping outside on a freezing winter day versus jumping directly into a freezing lake.
That is a perfect analogy.
The air cools you down more gradually than the fluid.
Exactly. The vapor forces the sperm samples to cool down at a more gradual, controlled rate.
So they pass through the critical freezing point slower.
Yes, allowing the glycerol time to manage the minimal water content effectively without shocking the cell.
And then what?
Once the vials have spent a set amount of time in the vapor and have fully frozen, they are then plunged into the liquid nitrogen pool for permanent long-term storage.
That is fascinating. This biological quirk of the sperm cell, its extreme resilience and ability to survive a slower, simpler freeze, has to have massive clinical implications.
No, it certainly does.
It's not just a neat laboratory trick, right? The sources emphasize that this alters patient care entirely.
It is a foundational pillar of modern clinical logistics. The robust nature of sperm freezing provides essential flexibility for the clinic and the patients.
Can we give an example?
Sure. In severe male factor infertility scenarios, for instance,
Okay.
where viable sperm cannot be provided naturally and must be surgically extracted directly from testicular tissue.
Which sounds incredibly invasive.
It is. The lab can take that highly precious, limited tissue and freeze it securely using these protocols.
Oh, I get it. It ensures that a painful surgical retrieval only has to happen once.
Exactly. The biological material is safely banked for future use.
Wow.
It also completely decouples the treatment timeline for partners.
What do you mean?
Well, if a patient's partner cannot be physically present at the clinic on the specific, unmovable day of the egg retrieval.
Like due to travel or work?
Right. Due to overseas military deployment, a sudden illness, or just complex travel logistics.
They don't have to cancel the cycle?
No, they can simply provide a sample months in advance, the laboratory freezes it, and the clinical team proceeds with absolute confidence that the biological material will survive the thaw and be perfectly viable on the exact day it is required.
That is amazing. It removes an enormous layer of logistical stress from an already intensely stressful medical process.
It really is a game changer for patient care.
But, regardless of the pathway, whether it is the hyperfast glass state vitrification of a fragile day 5 embryo or the steady, robust vapor freeze of a sperm vial,
Right.
every single one of these cells ultimately arrives at the exact same destination.
They do. They all end up in the storage vault.
The flash freeze or the vapor drop might only take seconds or minutes, but once that cellular time is truly paused, the material must be transferred to an environment capable of holding that pause indefinitely.
Exactly.
And the physical infrastructure of the vault is where the science of thermodynamics meets the engineering of extreme endurance.
It's a very different kind of science than the biology on the bench.
Let's mentally walk into that vault, because the environment described in the sources is striking.
It's an imposing room.
You step into this dedicated room in the clinic, and you are surrounded by these massive, heavily insulated, brushed stainless steel tanks.
They look immovable.
And there is a very deliberate, low mechanical hum in the room. But despite all the high-tech appearances, one of the most astonishing facts from our sources is how these tanks actually maintain their sub-zero environments.
It is a reality that often completely surprises people when they visit a lab.
It surprised me.
We instinctively associate highly advanced, life-sustaining medical equipment with massive power requirements.
Right. Yeah, giant refrigeration compressors, heavy-duty cables.
Right. But these critical cryopreservation tanks operate entirely off the grid.
Off the grid.
Absolutely zero electrical power is required to maintain the minus 196-degree deep freeze.
How is that even possible? How do you hold an environment at nearly 200 degrees below freezing without plugging it into a wall?
The temperature is maintained purely through the elemental physics of the chemical inside them.
Liquid nitrogen.
Yes. Nitrogen, which makes up the majority of the air we breathe right now, is a gas at room temperature.
Right.
But when it's industrially compressed and aggressively cooled, it changes state and becomes a liquid.
Okay.
And the fundamental law governing this liquid is its boiling point.
The boiling point, the temperature at which it stops being a liquid and turns back into a gas.
Exactly. And the boiling point of liquid nitrogen is a physical constant of minus 196 degrees Celsius.
Minus 196.
As long as the nitrogen remains in a liquid state, its temperature simply cannot fluctuate. It cannot be minus 190 or minus 200. It is physically locked at minus 196.
So, simply by filling the tank with this liquid, the internal environment is mathematically guaranteed to be held precisely at that sub-zero constant.
It is a law of physics.
So the electrical grid could fail entirely, the city could go dark for a week, and the embryos inside that tank wouldn't notice a thing.
Not a single thing. The cold is chemically guaranteed.
That is incredible. But that creates a massive engineering challenge, doesn't it?
Oh, a huge one.
If liquid nitrogen boils at minus 196 degrees, then a room temperature clinic sitting at, 22 degrees Celsius is essentially a blast furnace to that liquid.
It is.
How do you keep the liquid from just boiling away into gas the second you put it in the tank?
You have to isolate the liquid nitrogen from the ambient heat of the room entirely.
Ow.
These tanks are marvels of thermodynamic isolation. They are designed as highly advanced, double-walled vacuum flasks.
A double-walled vacuum flask, like a high-end thermos.
Exactly like a thermos, just engineered to an extreme degree.
Let's map out that anatomy. What is physically separating the warm air of the room from the frozen core?
Well, there is an inner stainless steel wall that physically holds the pool of liquid nitrogen.
Okay.
And there's an outer stainless steel shell that you see when you look at the tank in the room.
Right.
The critical engineering lies in the space between those two metal walls. The air is completely pumped out of that space during manufacturing, creating a hard vacuum.
A vacuum? And why is a vacuum so effective at stopping heat?
Because heat energy requires physical matter to travel through.
Right.
It transfers through conduction, like touching a hot stove surface, or convection, which is warm air or liquid moving around.
So without matter?
Because a vacuum is utterly devoid of air molecules, there is practically no matter for the heat to ride on.
Wow.
Heat from the warm clinic room hits the outer seal shell, but it simply cannot cross the vacuum gap to reach the inner tank. It is the ultimate thermal blockade.
That explains the exterior of the tank perfectly, but what does the internal architecture actually look like?
It's very organized.
I mean, how do you organize thousands of microscopic embryos in a giant vat of freezing liquid? If you drop a straw in, it's gone forever?
Oh, absolutely. It requires a highly rigid, three-dimensional filing system.
Okay.
Suspended from the insulated neck of the tank are long metal canisters.
Canisters.
Inside each canister are stacked metal canes.
Canes.
And attached to these canes are brightly color-coded plastic goblets.
Goblets.
And finally, inside these specific goblets sit the individual, uniquely labeled patient straws holding the vitrified embryos, or oocytes.
So it's like a Russian nesting doll of organization.
Exactly. It is a precise coordinate system submerged in the sub-zero dark.
Now, regarding that submersion, the sources highlight a very important evolution in storage protocols that I definitely want to explore.
Okay.
There is a distinct difference between storing a patient's straw directly in the liquid nitrogen versus storing it in the vapor phase.
Yes, a very crucial evolution.
Why does the exact location in the tank matter so much?
It is a critical distinction born out of an abundance of caution regarding cross-contamination.
Cross-contamination.
Historically, it was standard practice to plunge all patient straws directly into the dense pool of liquid nitrogen at the very bottom of the tank.
Because that's where it's coldest.
Well, the temperature there is perfectly uniform. However, liquid nitrogen, despite being incredibly cold, is still a fluid medium.
And fluid can act as a transportation network.
Precisely. While the risk is considered theoretically microscopic, scientists had to acknowledge the physical reality.
What's the reality?
If a virus or a bacterial contaminant were somehow introduced into that liquid pool, perhaps from a single compromised patient sample, the fluid currents could, in theory, circulate that contaminant.
Oh, wow.
And allow it to come into contact with other submerged patient straws.
Wait. A virus can survive at minus 196 degrees.
Absolutely.
Really?
Yes, the exact same extreme cold that perfectly preserves a human embryo will perfectly preserve a viral particle. The cold does not kill, it simply suspends.
That makes total sense, but it's unsettling. So, to completely eliminate this shared fluid risk, many modern laboratories transition to vapor phase storage.
Yes.
So how does vapor phase storage solve the problem? You still have the liquid nitrogen in the tank, right?
You do. But instead of submerging the canisters into the liquid pool at the bottom, the tanks are engineered, so the biological samples are suspended entirely in the dense nitrogen vapor layer that hovers just above the liquid line.
Ah. Think of it like suspending the samples in a thick, freezing fog rather than dropping them into a shared lake.
That's a perfect visual.
But if they aren't touching the liquid, is the fog actually cold enough to maintain the glass state we talked about earlier? Doesn't the temperature rise as you move away from the liquid?
It does rise slightly, yes,
Yeah.
but the vapor immediately above the boiling liquid is incredibly dense and maintains a temperature well below the critical glass transition threshold.
How cold is it?
It typically hovers safely around minus 190 degrees Celsius.
Oh, so plenty cold enough?
More than enough. And because
Yeah.
the environment is a gas and not a shared liquid pool, there is no fluid vector for a contaminant to swim through.
So it completely severs the physical pathway for viral cross-contamination between individual patient samples.
Exactly, while maintaining flawless thermal preservation.
It's a really elegant solution. You get the freezing power of the nitrogen without the shared bath.
Right.
But understanding that these tanks hold the literal future potential of thousands of families naturally brings us to the monumental task of security.
Security is paramount.
We are talking about keeping track of microscopic specks in a freezing fog for decades. How does a clinic ensure that a specific embryo is flawlessly identified and protected over that kind of time span?
This is where the laboratory assumes the burden of an unbroken chain of security.
Okay.
Managing the extreme cold is merely an engineering problem. Managing human identity across decades is a profound logistical responsibility.
That's a great way to put it.
And that rigid identity verification actually reaches its absolute peak long before the sample ever enters the tank.
Right, our sources are very clear on this. The identity must be locked before the temperature drops.
The protocols are relentless. Before an embryo is ever exposed to the vitrification solutions we talked about, the patient's unique data must be cross-verified through dual independent witnessing.
Dual independent, meaning two people.
Yes. One embryologist will read aloud the patient's full name, their date of birth, their unique medical record number, and the exact developmental grading of the specific embryo.
And the second person?
A second, entirely independent embryologist must physically stand there and visually verify every single piece of that data.
Checking it against what?
Against the printed paperwork, the electronic laboratory database, and the physical label on the microstraw.
And if there's any discrepancy?
The process stops. The fluid swap cannot proceed until both scientists verbally confirm a perfect absolute match.
But that physical label introduces a massive logistical hurdle that the sources explicitly point out.
It does.
How do you label a tiny plastic straw that is going to be plunged into minus 196 degrees? I mean, I have trouble getting a standard adhesive label to stay on a plastic container in my regular freezer for a week.
It's a huge problem.
If you put a sticker or regular ink into liquid nitrogen, the extreme cold will cause the adhesive to instantly crystallize and shatter, and the ink will just flake off.
It is a severe molecular challenge. Traditional labeling methods simply cannot survive the sub-zero immersion.
Let alone decades of it.
Or the extreme thermal expansion and contraction that occurs if a straw is briefly lifted into the warmer neck of the tank for a routine inventory check.
Right. And if a label detaches in the tank.
The sample's identity is lost forever, which is a catastrophic failure.
So what's the solution?
Modern embryology labs have abandoned stickers entirely and moved to advanced permanent etching.
Etching. So they are altering the physical straw itself?
Yes. They utilize specialized medical lasers or advanced thermal fusion printers. A laser will literally melt the patient's identification data, etching the alphanumeric characters directly into the molecular matrix of the plastic straw.
Or the thermal printer.
Thermal printers use intense heat to fuse a specialized resin deep into the plastic surface.
The identity basically becomes structurally woven into the plastic. It can't peel off because it is the straw.
Exactly. It guarantees that the text will withstand decades of abrasive liquid or vapor nitrogen exposure without fading, smudging, or detaching.
So the identity is permanently secured. But what about the physical tank itself?
What about it?
Well, we established earlier that the tank relies on a vacuum seal, not electricity, to stay cold.
Right.
Which is fantastic for surviving a power grid failure. But vacuums aren't magic. They can fail.
They certainly can.
What if a microscopic fracture develops in the steel shell? What if the vacuum begins to degrade and heat slowly starts leaking into the tank, causing the liquid nitrogen to boil off faster than normal?
That is a real threat.
And if the tanks are essentially silent, How does the lab know there is a problem before the liquid runs dry and the temperature spikes?
They know because the physical tanks are wrapped in an invisible net of continuous 247 automated telemetry.
Telemetry, okay.
Yes. While the fundamental cooling mechanism requires zero electricity, the monitoring infrastructure is heavily electrified and endlessly vigilant.
Let's pull back the curtain on that telemetry. What are these sensors actually doing in the dark?
The tanks are wired with highly sensitive multi-point electronic sensors, and they are executing continuous data logging on two distinct critical parameters inside every single tank in the facility.
What's the first parameter?
First, they measure the ambient environment using specialized thermocouples suspended inside the vapor phase of the tank.
Thermocouples, just high-tech thermometers.
Basically, these sensors constantly read the exact air temperature minute by minute.
Okay, and the second parameter?
Second, they utilize highly advanced ultrasonic sensors, or pressure differentials, to constantly measure the exact physical depth of the liquid nitrogen pool sitting at the bottom of the tank.
How does an ultrasonic sensor measure liquid nitrogen?
It acts like a highly localized sonar system.
Sonar, like on a submarine.
Exactly like that. The sensor emits an inaudible sound wave straight down into the tank. That sound wave travels through the freezing vapor, hits the dense surface of the liquid nitrogen pool, and bounces back up to the sensor.
Wow.
By calculating the exact microsecond it takes for the echo to return, the computer can determine the precise millimeter depth of the liquid pool.
So the computer knows the temperature of the air and the depth of the fluid every second of every day. It's like a dedicated ICU monitor for a metal thermos.
It really is. And that continuous data feed is tied to a cascading, redundant alarm system.
Let's return to my hypothetical scenario. A microscopic fracture develops in the outer wall, and the vacuum begins to slowly fail. Room temperature heat begins to slowly seep in.
Okay. In that scenario, the liquid nitrogen will begin to boil off slightly faster to absorb that incoming heat and maintain the minus 196 baseline.
So the temperature won't rise immediately, but the liquid will disappear faster.
Precisely. Long before the temperature ever changes, the ultrasonic sensor will detect that the liquid level is dropping a fraction of a millimeter faster than the historical baseline average for that specific tank.
It's that sensitive.
Yes. Or, if a lid isn't sealed properly, the thermocouple will detect a half-degree temperature rise in the upper vapor phase.
And when a sensor detects that shift, what is the actual response? Does a bell just ring in a dark, empty clinic at 3 a.m.?
The protocol is vastly more aggressive than a local siren.
I would hope so.
The moment a parameter crosses a predefined microthreshold, the automated telemetry system triggers an external alert cascade.
What does that entail?
It will immediately begin phoning, texting, and paging the on-call embryology and laboratory director team. It routes these alerts to multiple devices simultaneously, bypassing any do not disturb settings on their phones.
So an embryologist gets a critical alert on their phone in the middle of the night.
Yes. And because the telemetry caught the anomaly at the micro level, the embryologist has the most valuable resource possible.
Time.
Time. They can physically drive to the laboratory, access the compromised tank, and evaluate the situation calmly.
Because the cold buffer is still there.
Exactly. Because the thermal mass of the remaining liquid nitrogen is so immense, the tank will remain perfectly frozen for hours or even days after the initial alarm.
They aren't rushing in to save melting cells.
No. The embryologist can either manually refill the liquid nitrogen to stabilize the tank or safely, methodically transfer the patient canes to a dedicated backup tank.
So the integrity of the vitrified cells is protected long before the internal temperature ever comes remotely close to the dangerous glass transition threshold.
It is an entirely unbroken chain of fail-safes.
It is truly staggering to map all of this out.
It's a lot to take in.
We've explored the physics of the water molecule and the destruction of ice crystals. We've traced the precise chemical choreography of the cryoprotectants using sucrose to pump out water while antifreeze slips inside.
Right.
We've visualized the high-speed vitrification plunge, turning fluid to glass at 20,000 degrees a minute. We've seen the unique vapor phase pathways for resilient sperm cells.
And we've walked through the laser-etched, sonar-monitored vaults of liquid nitrogen.
But having mapped the mechanics, I feel like we need to zoom out.
I agree.
We need to connect this massive thermodynamic endeavor back to the human element. We have to look at the preservation horizon and answer the ultimate question for the patient. Why does this extreme journey actually matter?
It matters because mastering this physics fundamentally alters the landscape of human potential.
Yes.
But before we can appreciate that clinical empowerment, We have to use the science we've just discussed to dismantle a very common, very pervasive fear.
I know exactly the fear you are referring to, because it is an entirely natural human assumption. We are conditioned by our reality to believe that time degrades absolutely everything. A car engine rusts, an apple on the counter rots, our own bodies age. Time is decay.
That's how we experience the world.
So the pervasive myth is this. Does the biological quality of an embryo or an oocyte naturally degrade the longer it stays frozen in that tank?
Right.
Like if a patient waits 5 years to use their embryo, is it somehow older or weaker than if they used it after 1 month?
The answer is an emphatic, mathematically proven no.
No degradation at all.
None. To understand why, we simply have to return to the physics of minus 196 degrees Celsius and the amorphous glass state of vitrification.
Okay.
Aging and degradation are fundamentally driven by chemical reactions and cellular metabolism.
Right. Cells dividing, proteins breaking down.
Yes, at minus 196 degrees, there is absolutely zero molecular kinetic energy available to fuel those reactions. All enzymatic activity is halted. The cellular metabolism drops to absolute zero.
So the machinery that causes aging is completely unplugged.
Exactly. There is no biological clock ticking. The passage of chronological time continues relentlessly outside the steel walls of the tank. But inside the microscopic glass state of that cell, time physically does not exist.
Time does not exist. That gives me chills.
The cell has been removed from the flow of time. Therefore, decades of clinical data and physical laws confirm that an embryo stored safely for 10 years possesses the exact same clinical implantation potential, the exact same viability as an embryo stored for 10 days.
Because it hasn't aged a second?
The quality cannot degrade because the biological mechanisms required for degradation are entirely paused.
10 years in the tank carries the exact same potential as 10 days. When a patient truly internalizes that reality, it completely transforms how we approach the entire timeline of family building.
It is a total paradigm shift.
How did it used to be?
Well, it takes what historically had to be a single, incredibly high-stakes biological sprint and turns it into a sustainable, manageable pathway.
Because before vitrification.
In the early days of IVF, a patient had to undergo heavy ovarian stimulation, retrieve the eggs, create the embryos, and then transfer an embryo back into the uterus immediately, all within a few physically exhausting weeks.
That sounds grueling.
It was. And if that fresh transfer failed, the entire grueling process had to start over from scratch.
But perfectly halting time acts as a bridge. It decouples the clinical steps.
Exactly. It separates the collection of potential from the utilization of potential.
So you can break it up into phases.
Yes. We can guide a patient through a single ovarian stimulation cycle, retrieve a cohort of oocytes, fertilize them, and flawlessly vitrify the resulting day 5 embryos.
And just stop.
And just stop. The biological potential is now secured in the vault. This instantly removes the immense pressure of having to rapidly prepare the patient's uterine environment for a transfer while their body is still heavily impacted by the stimulation medications.
You can just let the patient's body rest and reset naturally.
We let the natural hormones balance. We can wait for a subsequent month or a subsequent year to precisely optimize the uterine lining.
And then just reach into the vault.
And then simply reach into the vault and warm a single embryo when the environment is absolutely perfect. It provides multiple optimized transfer opportunities generated from a single initial retrieval.
It gives control of the timeline back to the patient entirely.
It does.
And the sources point out that this specific empowerment extends far beyond routine reproductive assistance. It provides absolutely critical, life-altering options for oncology patients.
That is undeniably its most vital application.
Tell us about that.
If a young patient receives a devastating cancer diagnosis, they are often facing immediate aggressive chemotherapy or radiation protocols.
Right.
Treatments that will systematically destroy their ovarian reserve or completely halt their sperm production.
So curing the cancer destroys their fertility.
Very often, yes. But cryopreservation offers an immediate biological lifeline. Within a matter of weeks, prior to the start of the toxic treatments, the clinical team can retrieve and vitrify their oocytes, their sperm, or their embryos.
They are permanently protecting that reproductive tissue from the fallout of the chemotherapy.
Exactly. We safely lock their future potential in the vault, entirely shielding it from the toxicity, while they are free to focus all of their physical and emotional energy on fighting for their life.
And then, hopefully,
when they're in remission, years later, their biological potential is waiting for them, entirely untouched by the disease or the cure.
That is just So powerful. And equally, this mastery of time empowers proactive elective fertility preservation too, right?
Absolutely. A woman who wants to secure her reproductive options while she pursues her career or waits for the right partner can choose to freeze her oocytes at age 30.
Right.
She perfectly pauses their biological age and their chromosomal health at 30, even if she does not plan to warm and fertilize them until she is 42.
We are effectively decoupling chronological age from biological potential.
Yes. We are handing people the scientific tools to align their reproductive capacity with the complex realities of their actual lives.
Wow.
And when you stand in that quiet cryopreservation room, listening to the low hum of the liquid nitrogen tanks, that is the profound reality you are surrounded by.
I can only imagine.
The laboratory is acting as a temporary, dedicated custodian of a family's future. The embryologists are balancing the purest, coldest laws of thermodynamic engineering with immeasurable human hope.
Custodians of future potential.
We freeze these cells with absolute perfection so that the patients have the ultimate freedom to live their lives, secure in the knowledge that their potential is waiting for them exactly as they left it.
That is a deeply moving way to conceptualize the intense physics and chemistry happening in that room. Let's take a moment to look back at the immense ground we have covered today.
It's been a journey.
We have thoroughly mapped the sub-zero journey of cryopreservation. We started by confronting the terrifying reality of water molecules and how the historical attempts at slow freezing ultimately struggled against the destructive microscopic needles of ice crystals.
Right.
We dove deep into the complex chemical choreography of the biological shield, exploring how the non-permeating sucrose creates a powerful osmotic vacuum to pull water out, while the permeating antifreeze slips through the membrane to provide structural support.
We followed the intense, nerve-wracking focus of the embryologist as they manually guided the M1 and M2 oocytes through the equilibration and vitrification solutions.
We understood the high-stakes race against the toxicity clock and how they rely on real-time visual tracking of the cell's osmotic collapse under the microscope.
And we break down the staggering physics of the microload, stripping away the thermal insulation down to a sub-microliter film and the 20,000 degree per minute plunge that forces the fluid to bypass crystallization entirely and solidify into a flawless, amorphous glass.
We contrasted that intense sequence with the biological resilience of the low-water sperm cell and its controlled vapor phase pathway.
And of course, we laid out the unyielding security infrastructure of the storage vaults. The off-the-grid, double-walled vacuum physics that hold the liquid nitrogen constantly at minus 196 degrees.
The specific clinical advantages of vapor phase storage to eliminate cross-contamination, the molecular permanence of laser-etched identification, and the relentless 247 ultrasonic telemetry guarding against the slightest thermal shift.
It is a phenomenal intersection of cellular biology, fluid dynamics, and extreme engineering.
It truly is. We want to thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep, deliberate exploration of paused biological time. Grasping this thermodynamic foundation is absolutely crucial to appreciating the staggering science that supports modern family building.
Of course, successfully pausing time in a glass state is only half the journey.
That's right, because a cell cannot divide, grow, or fulfill its biological destiny while trapped in microscopic glass. Eventually, the chronological clock must be restarted.
Which is exactly where we're heading next.
I want to tease our next deep dive, Episode 15, Frozen Embryo Warming and Transfer Preparation. In our upcoming discussion, we are going to reverse this entire thermodynamic process.
We will explore the exact fluid mechanics required to rapidly melt that glass state without forming ice.
Safely draw those toxic cryoprotectants back out of the cell and slowly rehydrate the internal architecture to wake the embryo back up without causing osmotic shock.
We will also look at how the lab evaluates post-thaw survival and coordinates perfectly with the clinical team for transfer day.
You will not want to miss it.
Before we close out today's exploration, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Something that stretches the boundaries of everything we have discussed today.
What's that?
We have conclusively proven that we can safely pause human biology at a single cellular level, perfectly preserving its function and potential against the relentless, decaying flow of chronological time.
Right.
So if we can master these extreme thermodynamics to completely arrest the aging process of a single cell, what might this profound mastery eventually teach us about the broader limits and perhaps the ultimate longevity of human life itself?
A fascinating and profound question to end on. Until next time, keep looking deeper.